Yeah, so I think that cybersecurity is becoming a major challenge nowadays for both individuals, small companies, as well, obviously for enterprises and governments. We're seeing that if you measure just cybercrime, and cybercrime is one out of several potential threats, including cyber terrorism, nation-state cyber attacks, as well as script kiddies launching attacks against individuals and organizations. So if you measure only cybercrime and you rank that in terms of its comparison to the GDP of different countries, it would be ranked as actually number 24, with about half a trillion dollars in damages, annual damages that it inflicts on enterprises. So obviously it's a major driving force in today's global economy. That's one measure that you can take a look at that. Another measure is the fact that more than 500 million consumers have been hit in 2013 by personal cyber attacks, whether it is phishing attacks, identity theft, or financial ramifications associated with such attacks. Finally, if you look at the spending that enterprises actually spend on cybersecurity, we're talking about probably between 80 to 90 billion dollars a year in actual spending by enterprises on cybersecurity solutions. By the way, 2/3 of that are professional services and about 1/3 are products. And this is another indication of the magnitude of the problem. We're saying that enterprises are spending between $4 to $6 million annually on cybersecurity solutions nowadays. So small and medium-sized businesses are actually nowadays becoming more and more targeted by cybersecurity challenges. The reason is that the cost of launching an attack against a business is actually going down. There's huge investments done by cyber crime organizations and cyber terrorists to actually make their side of the business, and it is a business for them, much more efficient and effective. And as such, the cost of launching an attack against an organization, especially in certain sectors like financial services, insurance, critical infrastructure, municipal transportation and such, are actually becoming lower. In fact, today on the black market, you can buy an attack, let's say a Zeus variant or something to that extent, for a price as low as $150 that can inflict damages on a financial organization in the range of millions to tens of millions of dollars. A lot of SMEs, both B2C and B2B ones, have web presence, which are critical in order to implement their business, whether it is for commerce purposes, for marketing purposes, and so forth. These web presences, typically hosted by third parties and so forth, are highly vulnerable to simple attacks known as DDoS attack, distributed denial of service, or other such like forms of attacks. They're very vulnerable to theft. So, for example, it's very easy to install software on those web servers that monitors all the activity and all the transactions that happen there and can relay that to your competition or to take advantage of, for example, credit card information that is deposited with you and so forth. And as such, these organizations are, given the fact that they rely on third parties in most cases to come up with the right cybersecurity solutions, they are highly exposed today while not taking the needed measures. Another example that is uniquely associated with SME is their increased reliance and use of cloud services. So SMEs, because they're unable to necessarily invest significant amounts of money in putting together the right IT infrastructure for CRM, for HR, for other such supply chain and so forth, they use more and more what's known as a SaaS provider, software as a service provider, such as Salesforce in the CRM domain, SuccessFactors in the HR domains, and so forth. Once you start using those cloud services, you essentially deposit your most critical asset, your data sets, your information with those third parties. Those third parties that you need to trust fully And these third parties, by their own, are exposed to both internal threats as well as attacks from the outside. So, if I'm an SME and I put my customer list on Salesforce, question comes to mind is, what if Salesforce gets hacked? Okay, who will protect me? And once this information has been hacked, what are the containment processes that are around? Can I really get an alert ahead of time about this breach that has occurred? So all these questions are more prevalent with SMEs rather than with large companies that tend to be more equipped in terms of internal system as well as when they deal with service providers and partners. So cyber innovation is really trying to, from our perspective, trying to revolutionize the industry end to end. I'll maybe illustrate that with an example. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think that you can buy today on the black market a variant of an attack against a financial services organization for as low as $150. That specific attack can be translated into profits for the hackers in the range of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, this is a very basic financial inequality that exists between the black hat community and the defensive community. And the question comes to mind, why is that the case? The answer is that it's pretty easy to circumvent and bypass existing defensive mechanisms, most of which are based on signature or behavioral aspects. And if the bad guys can put their hands on such a defensive mechanism and they can buy them off the street, or they can essentially develop their attacks against those defensive lines and easily bypass them. Once they do that, by typically a minor change to their existing malware or viruses, then they can very cost effectively do that. So the question comes to mind is, how can we prevent such a reuse by the attacking side? How can we make the cost of launching an attack dramatically higher? Okay, and by that, we actually put a whole set of targets, essentially small and medium-sized enterprises, out of range, out of the ROI range for those attackers. And what we would define as innovation is actually a company that would go around and prevent, for example, such a reuse of components by the attacker side. By preventing that reuse, we're actually changing dramatically the economic inequilibrium that exists today between the black hat hackers and the white hat community. It's a very important topic to discuss, and that's the human capital infrastructure that is underlying both the attack side as well as the defensive side in cybersecurity. Most of the highly trained individuals in the space on the attack side actually come from government organizations that within certain rogue countries that were trained initially to inflict cyber attacks by nation states, cyber warfare, and gradually found their way onto typically cybercrime organizations and other cyber terrorism at times. And this is where most of the human capital comes on the attack side. Actually, it's the same thing on the defensive side. Most of the highly trained and most of the innovation that comes on the cyber defense side comes from, again, government-trained individuals, typically within the Western countries, that find their way after a period of anywhere between 6, 9, 10 years of serving their country. They find their way into the commercial, industrial organizations, find their way into both multinational corporations such as EMC, Lockheed Martin, GE, Cisco, Intel, Microsoft, and others, as well as into startups. And in regions where the startup mentality is abound, then you can find startups that actually try to tackle the most difficult problem in the cybersecurity domains. We do find these in the Boston area, we find these in the Washington, D.C. area, and obviously quite a bit of them in Israel. And so I think that the statistics show that the average spending of an enterprise on cybersecurity solution has increased from, if I remember correctly, from around $1.4 million in 2011 to around $2.5 million in 2012, $4 million in 2013, and continue to grow. So we're seeing a dramatic growth in the spending of enterprises on cybersecurity. This is obviously driven by the fact that with the advent of new IT paradigms and technologies into the market, they need to overhaul their existing cybersecurity defensive lines. I mean, the assumptions about the IT security of the past regarding trusted environments, trusted user, trusted machine, full control of the trusted zone, zero trust in the uncontrolled environment, these assumptions are not valid anymore. As a result of that, they need to ramp up their spending, as well as partially driven also by the compliance and the regulation that forces them to do so, especially with CEOs and CIOs being personally on the line for falling short in providing the needed cybersecurity defensive mechanisms. I believe that government has a huge role to play in the preparedness of the industry for cybersecurity. And that role changes according to the individual companies. So certainly companies like critical infrastructure companies, electricity, water, oil and gas, transportation, smart city and so forth, they require quite a bit of government, not only regulation, but also involvement in auditing and in preventative measures to be implemented in order to protect the lives of citizens against cyber warfare threats and such. The role of the government with different organizations, such as financial services, such as insurance companies and so forth, is a little bit different. Certainly it should legislate the right regulations in place so that organizations are well prepared to cope with the primarily market and financial ramification of a potential cyber attack, but less so in terms of auditing and actually preventative measures to be taken for these kind of organizations. I think that another major role that a government have is in education. Okay, we see still that the largest or that the most significant ROI that can be generated for cybersecurity is by the right education, starting from the early stages, even with kids, all the way up to public awareness campaigns, and we think that government should definitely contribute to that. Finally, I think, again, cyber innovation is of key importance in the space, and what we're seeing is that some governments, even in well-developed countries, are actually hindering innovation in the space. They're hindering innovation in the space because they're limiting the collaboration around cybersecurity. Collaboration in cybersecurity is critical. Defensive organizations cannot develop the right solutions without the collaboration of their customers or the governments. Government should take an active role in encouraging such collaboration in order for innovation to find its way into the market. JVP, or Jerusalem Venture Partner, is Israel's leading venture capital firm. We've been around for 20 years. Cybersecurity has been one of our focus areas for more than a decade now. And we're investing in companies starting from the early stage, the seed stage as they call it, investment phase, all the way to late stage investments in companies that are already market leader in their respective spaces. Our goal is to continue to invest in what we call the bleeding edge, high risk, high reward kind of cyber technology innovation companies. We see about 200 or so new cybersecurity every year. We have an aim to invest in 3 or 4 such companies each year. So it's less than 2% of the companies that we're seeing that we wind up actually investing in, and to create the next category leaders in this domain. So at JVP, about 3 years ago, when we decided to focus on cybersecurity, we looked for a physical location that can be the location for our next center of excellence in cyber. And we scanned the world. We had dialogues with certain states in the US, Maryland, around the Washington, D.C. area, Boston, Silicon Valley, as well as in two regions in Europe that were interested in collaborating with us around that specific theme. We eventually decided to open up our second Center of Excellence in Beersheba in the south of Israel, which we believe enjoys a very unique ecosystem that you cannot find elsewhere in the world. Side by side with the huge government spending driven by the national level need that exists today in Israel, which starts now to trickle human capital into the industrial environment. We're seeing excellence in academia, we're seeing multinational corporations setting up shops, leveraging off of that human capital, as well as the startup mentality and the availability of capital to actually go and invest in those early stage cybersecurity companies. This unique ecosystem, with presence of companies like Deutsche Telekom, EMC, IBM, Lockheed Martin, Oracle, and others. This is something that you cannot find elsewhere in the world. And this is all happening within a radius of less than 1 square mile. Now, we're talking about tens of thousands of Army-trained individuals coming out of the C5I IDF headquarters with the Intelligence Corps unit, finding their way through academia to those multinational corporations and the startups that we're setting up, creating a very unique ecosystem and a very interesting pool of talent that cannot be found elsewhere. Compliance and regulation has really been a driving force in cybersecurity for many years. Regulators in the past did not really take it fully and committed to making sure that the right regulations and compliance measures are being legislated. This has changed over the last 2 or 3 years. People have understood that the threat of cybersecurity requires activity also in the legislature bodies and so forth to actually come up with the right mechanisms to have companies comply with. We're seeing that regulations, especially in financial services, healthcare, insurance, critical infrastructure, are really the driving force behind such decisions, purchasing decisions made by those different companies. And not the least of which is the personal liability that was put on executives, CEO, CIO, CFO of these organizations in regards to the preparedness of the organization to such an attack. Even in unregulated industries, such as, for example, retail, we can see, for example, the effect of a target attack as one example, and the result of that, of the CEO having to leave his position, is something that actually drives a lot of the purchasing decision being made today by such companies. There is a question that comes to mind in regards to, okay, so why not just disconnect all those critical systems from the internet or from any other communication network, and by that dramatically increase their defensive situation? And what we're seeing nowadays is that actually the trend is just the opposite. So more and more critical systems are actually getting connected to the internet and to other operational network. The reason that companies choose to take that risk of increasing the vulnerability of their systems rather than letting them stay unconnected is the fact that the operational benefits associated with efficiencies driven by carefully monitoring, auditing, and so forth, those systems by far exceed the risk associated with the cyber attacks and other such like risk associated with connecting those systems to the internet. The power of 1% is actually a concept that was defined by GE, General Electric, in regard to help quantify what would be the impact of 1% operational improvements in the efficiency of certain industries like oil and gas, energy and aviation, transportation and so forth, what would be the effect of such a 1% increase in operational efficiency as compared to the risk associated with connected the system. And just as an example, 1% increase in operational efficiencies of the aviation industry, which can easily be achieved by connecting, for example, the aircraft in the air to be able to report maintenance issues while they're in the air rather than waiting till the time that they hit the ground, is by far exceeding, so the benefit out of that 1% is by far exceeding the annual industry-wide net profits as a whole. So that means that by just connecting certain elements, such as airplane engines and so forth, you are able to create yield or ROI, which is more than doubling up the profit of such an industry.